Okay, let's make a start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event. I'm Andy Gouldson. I'm one of the leads of the Place-Based Climate Action Network, and I'm chairing today's discussion. You're very welcome. We're looking forward to an interesting, engaging hour. The main focus of the report of the webinar is to launch our report, Trends in Local Climate Action in the UK, and our co-director Candice Howarth will be presenting that shortly. And then we have, we're very pleased to have contributions from Philippa Borrowman from the Green Alliance and from Louise Marix Evans, who've both been involved in similar reports on a similar theme in the last few months. And so there's much to be learned from coming together and looking at this in the round. And then we also have a contribution from Councillor Edwina Hannaford from Cornwall Council, who's going to reflect on what this means for policy and practice. We then have some time for question and answers. So if you could post any questions you might have in the Q&A box, and also keep an eye on them and vote for the ones that you wish to prioritize. I'm sure we won't have time to answer all of your questions, but we'll get to as many as we can. So please do vote for the ones that you want to prioritize. Otherwise, I think we need to say that this event is being recorded and we trust you're okay with that. If you're not, presumably you will leave. And I think that later on the event will be made available to other people via our website. So without further ado, let's kick off. I'm really pleased to introduce Candice Howarth. As I said a second ago, Candice is co-director of the Place-Based Climate Action Network, which is a joint initiative funded by the ESRC and spread across LSE, University of Leeds, University of Edinburgh and Queen's University Belfast. And Candice has been the lead author for the report, which she's about to give us an overview of. So Candice, can I hand over to you?
Great, thanks very much, Andy. I'm going to share my screen. Right, can everyone see that? Yeah, okay, great. Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Andy. I'm based at the LSE Grantham Research Institute, but very much part of the broader PCAN network, which Andy just gave an overview of. And as he mentioned, I'm the coordinating lead author of this report, but this is very much a collaborative piece of work over several months. And as you can see from the bottom of the screen there also, we have thanks extended to a range of people also who help contribute to ensure the report is robust, but also who helped in the review stages towards the end as well. Now, I don't have time to go through all of the report today. You will be getting a link to the report where it's positioned on the website, so do take a look. So I'll try and give you a glimpse of some of the key findings from the report, and then looking forward to discussing these further in the Q&A. Now, as most of you know, there is widespread recognition that climate change is a global emergency. But we also know that much of this work is taking place and needs to take place at the local level. And this is very much what this report has focused on. And I'm very pleased that it actually is a contribution to a range of other reports that have been published over the last year or so around the role of the local level in delivering climate action. And some of the key points that we'd like you to take away from this report are outlined here. So in some of the analysis that we conducted, we found that 78% of local authorities have declared a climate emergency. So a huge proportion there. But the overwhelming focus of local climate action is still very much on the reduction of emissions and mitigation. And so despite the fact that managing the physical risks of climate change through adaptation has strong local salience, for example, through flood protection, we found that actually adaptation only features in 12% of the emergency declarations. And in some cases, this was really just the mention of climate adaptation and nothing beyond that. So there's a real gap there. What we've also found, and we've highlighted in this report, is that we're seeing extensive experimentation with new institutional models that help promote more inclusive and partnership-based approaches to local climate action. And the report really provides an overview of a range of these examples from local climate commissions, such as the PCAN city commissions, action networks, climate partnerships, and work from climate assemblies and climate juries. We're seeing a strong desire among local actors to combine climate action with strategies to tackle inequalities, promote economic regeneration, and ensure a just transition. So the report brings together a lot of this evidence. It brings together our own analysis on climate emergency declarations at the national level, but also provides an overview of the different range of projects that we've funded that look at different types of climate action at the local level, whether that be through democratic deliberative processes or local finance mechanisms. And we've also included a range of examples of different case studies of councils and different activities that are happening at the local level that help give a picture of what is going on. Now, in terms of local authority-led climate action, while we are seeing a burst of energy on climate action, which has been sustained over a number of months and years, as I mentioned earlier, 78% of local authorities have declared an emergency, but only a third of councils have published either a new or a refreshed climate action plan resulting from these declarations. So much more needs to be done. And we found and we highlight a range of barriers to local climate action. And these range from the lack of capacity and expertise within local authorities and local councils, limited or stretched funding, and the impact of national policy on the delivery of local climate action. And our analysis that you can see, part of which is in the bottom right-hand figure, part of our analysis shows that of the councils who have declared climate emergencies, the majority of these are either controlled by Labour, Liberal Democrats, Sinn Féin, or Plaid Cymru representatives. So we're seeing a marked difference there. We're also seeing very little coordination between the local and the national levels. And in England and Northern Ireland in particular, there doesn't seem to be a concrete plan outlining the role of local authorities in delivering net zero. Something else which we highlight in the report is significant gaps and limitations around data. So that's data availability, data access, and so forth. And while the UK is a leader in the provision of socioeconomic and environmental data, we're seeing some very important gaps that have been discovered through our analysis and other similar reports. So for example, some of the data is quite difficult to access. It can be quite difficult to be assembled and presented in a consistent way. And the granularity of the data varies considerably based on what type of data you're looking at. And when we looked at data on adaptation, we found that this was much less available than data on mitigation. Another focus of the report is community processes and networks. And what we do here is we outline the range of non-governmental, community-focused networks that aim to foster local climate action. And we see that these exist at a range of levels, including the international and UK levels. In terms of community-based processes and stakeholder engagement, we provide an overview of the different types of climate commissions that exist. So we have our own PCAN core commissions in the cities of Belfast, Edinburgh, and Leeds, but we've seen in the last year or so a phenomenal growth in the development of new climate commissions. And we list a range of these in the report. And many of these are independent. We found almost 20 of these. We found almost 30 which are led by local authorities, and a proportion that are also led by third sector organisations. And another core activity that we've seen over the last few years when it comes to local climate action is participatory governance processes. So for example, citizen juries and assemblies, which have really taken a front seat when it comes to climate change and engagement of the public, with the National Assembly last year. And the report also provides a list of the different assemblies and juries that we've seen over the last few years. But funding for these types of exercises is very limited, and it does raise a lot of issues around the effectiveness of these processes. Another aspect of the report focuses on finance and business engagement. So a lot of what PCAN does look at these different themes as well. And what we've seen is that there is severe underinvestment in local climate action, with an inadequate development of a project pipeline to help drive local climate action. And we're also seeing an inability to tap local pools of savings that can help finance and drive further local climate action. And some of the work that PCAN has funded through its flexible fund has been looking specifically at these types of projects. And what is reflecting some of the findings in the report is that much of the finance available for climate action is very much focused on decarbonisation and mitigation, with the real lack of investment on adaptation. Although we're starting to see a bit of a shift in this, with government funding focusing on flooding and coastal erosion risk management over the next few years. But there still is this strategic gap between high level availability and funding and the shifts that we're seeing in insurers and banking actors and the delivery of finance on the ground when it comes to climate action. So we do need considerably more funding going forward, particularly over the next decade. We're seeing this manifested through a couple of initiatives. So we have the new National Infrastructure Bank, which is being established, as well as this year, the government will issue the first green sovereign bond. But we're not all about finance, and we do also look at the role of business engagement as part of the commissions that we engage with and the broader activities on climate action. A lot of place-based partnerships on climate change bring together different actors, whether it be public, private, and civic. And when we talk about business, we're seeing a lot of new types of business actors that may go beyond the traditional definitions of how we define business. So in some of the commissions that we have and the different group and participatory processes that we're working on, we're seeing involvement not just by eco or green businesses, but by actors such as local football clubs, house builders, private sector representative, consultancies and law firms, water companies, opera companies. So a real range of rich actors who are really keen to play a role in the delivery of local climate action. Now, this has really been a whistle-stop tour of some of the key aspects of the project and the reports that we're publishing today. And I wanted to list a few of the recommendations that we make as part of all of this analysis. And we've targeted these at local authorities, local climate communities, and then national government and devolved administrations. Now, when it comes to local authorities and local communities, we're asking them to follow up their climate emergency declarations with robust climate action plans that are locally supported, that are evidence-based, and that are tangible. And importantly, we want them to focus on both mitigation and adaptation to try and rebalance some of those efforts. And with that in mind, it's really important that they consider issues of social and economic inequalities. Without this, the climate emergency narrative that has been built up will actually get devalued over time. We also want to encourage more collaborative and partnership-based approaches to climate action. These are really useful processes. They help to engage local actors, they help to energize and build on the expertise of non-state private and civic actors. So there's a real opportunity there to build on the momentum and energy that we're seeing. And the work that we've been doing through our climate commissions, for example, are a fantastic example of this. Now, for local authorities also, there's more that needs to be done when it comes to climate finance strategies. These can help mobilize local savings and attract wider pools of capital to fund the implementation of local climate action plans. And then turning to national government and the devolved administrations. Through the development of this report and the research that we've done, we've heard from local authorities that there's a real need for more recognition and leveraging of the agency and power of local communities in delivering climate action. We see that local climate action really is a critical channel for the delivery of national policies. It's rooted in responsive to local needs, and it's more and more ambitious in comparison to the national picture. But we need to see a coherent framework. We need one of these frameworks to be put in place to help support local climate action, which is then backed by appropriate centrally driven funds. And finally, we need to examine and overcome some of the barriers that exist at the institutional and policy levels, because often some of these hold back local climate action. And so to conclude, just a few final remarks. Where local authorities have acted, this has often been in a very collaborative way, and we're seeing this as a very successful model through which to deliver local climate action. And this includes the participation of local actors, businesses, and citizens. We do, however, see that there's a lack of ambition on how local authorities will reach their net zero targets. So tangible plans need to be put in place to really consider how these will be delivered. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, there's a very clear gap in terms of the focus on adaptation, and this does need to be rebalanced. So in order to be fair, inclusive, and just, climate action really needs to be done by and for local communities rather than done to them or imposed from above. And as I'm sure you're all very aware, the scale and the magnitude of the coronavirus pandemic has really thwarted some of the ambitions and the energy that we were seeing across local authorities just over a year ago. But we're hoping that things are starting to move forward now, and climate change is taking more of a prominent role. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Candice. Thank you also to everybody who's been posting in the Q&A box. Please do put any questions in there, and also have a scan through any questions that are there, and vote for the ones that you would like to see answered in the Q&A session shortly. So our next speaker is from the Green Alliance, Philippa Borrowman, and Green Alliance published an excellent report back in December looking at the local climate challenge and calling for a new partnership approach. So Philippa, we're looking forward to your contribution.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here today, everyone. This is a really great report, and I'm glad to be at the launch event. And if you haven't read it already, I highly recommend. I could have done with this research when I was doing my research last year, so it's really good. As a background, I'm Philippa. I'm a policy advisor at Green Alliance. I work on our low carbon team. So we're a charity and think tank representing ambitious leadership for the environment. And my main role has been around kind of carbon emissions and the local approach to this. And as Andy said, we launched the Local Climate Challenge at the end of last year, where we did desk-based research, but also interviews with a number of local authorities to kind of understand what's going on at the ground and what exactly needs to change in order for them to meet their declared climate emergencies. So I pulled out three themes I thought were kind of most relevant to me from my research and what came up in the report, which was up today. So I hope that's okay. I will start with the national government's role and kind of how they are treating local authorities in policy making. I think the first thing to acknowledge is that at the moment, policies from national government do not kind of address the fact that local authorities are really key partners, because they have those unique relationships with people, businesses and environments, which central government just don't have. And I think where in the past national policy has been successful at cutting emissions down in the power sector, for example, because that can be nationally led, transport and housing are areas which are really personal and really local issues, which just can't happen from just top-down approaches. And emissions from these sectors, have barely fallen since 1990. Transport has basically just plateaued. So something really needs to change. And I just wanted to flag the Green Homes grant, which came out at the end of last year as part of the COVID package. I think a lot of people agreed that it maybe wasn't as successful as it should have been, partly because it was a one-year policy anyway, but also the workforces locally weren't ready for this. And so that's just one example of a policy where it really needs that local buy-in, and it needs to be built with local leaders and national government in mind. And the next thing I wanted to discuss was knowledge and expertise at a local level. And we all know local authorities need more funding, but they also need to know what to do with it. So I think one thing that we pulled out in our report, and what came out in the report from today, is that there needs to be that kind of guidance and proper support for local authorities to be able to tackle this, and clear-cut ways in which they can decarbonise. And so we recommend a framework, as does the report today, which is set by central government and local authorities together, and it has clear steps on how to decarbonise, but with the fact that every area is different, and there needs to be that flexibility of how you're going to get there and make sure nobody is kind of badly impacted by these policies. And then the final thing I just wanted to talk about on expertise is the Bayes energy hubs. And when we did our research, in our interviews, a lot of local authorities just said how useful these Bayes energy hubs were as a model. I'm not sure everyone agrees, but I think it was, you know, a very large majority of the people we spoke to really appreciated having that kind of knowledge sharing base and being able to understand how to properly pull together investment and being able to fund projects which are, you know, quite complex, like energy. And then the final thing I wanted to touch on was community engagement, which is obviously a huge part of this report and really, really important. And we didn't really focus on it in our research, but obviously very aware that it's a really important part of climate action. And this isn't just a UK thing, it's a global issue. The COP conference is pulling together voices from developing countries and developed where we might not be able to hear from these people in a normal circumstance, and being able to properly speak to people who might be directly impacted by decarbonisation policies, I think is really, really important. And it also ensures a just transition, which is obviously a feature of this report. And so in terms of this engagement, obviously it also offers the opportunity to hear from different social classes, different genders, different ethnicities, and being able to speak with people at a local level will make sure that all policies are successful. And then the final thing on this is that it also allows to kind of have that discourse at a local level that wouldn't happen otherwise, and being able to, for local authorities to be able to explain exactly why these policies are being put in place. You know, why do we want people to stop driving their cars? Why do we want you to spend thousands of pounds on changing your home? That can only be done through proper kind of local communication. And that's why community engagement is just so key in all this. I think I'll stop there. I think I spoke for my allotted time, but happy to follow up with questions. And thank you very much.
Perfect, thank you, Philippa. Thanks again for the Q&A. The questions are flowing now, which is great. Keep them coming and keep voting if that's okay. Next up is Louise Marix Evans. Louise led the fantastic piece of work that the Committee on Climate Change also published in November or December, looking at local authorities and the 6th carbon budget. So Louise, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Candice and Philippa. Yeah, I think we were all doing the same research last year, weren't we? Yeah, really, really good report. And it was interesting to see that there were, between the 3 reports we've worked on, we were finding very similar things. So that's a good sign, I suppose. And so I don't want to repeat anything anyone else said, but the 4 things that we came to at the end of my CCC report were this need for a framework, a cohesive framework to link that national and local delivery, and to pick up those governance gaps that we've got, and to better align things. So the framework, local flexibility, so we're aiming for an outcome, we're sort of travelling in the same direction, but what the solution in Cornwall will be is going to be different to, say, in Leeds. So we can't have a one-size-fits-all. Particularly the finance, multi-year finance is needed. As Philippa said, a one-off, 1 year chucking money really hard at people, which they just can't process or use, is actually really negative. And I think the local authority delivery piece of the Green Homes Grant has proved much more successful because local authorities did work together and they could line up a pipeline for that delivery. And then the 4th thing I wanted to see was facilitation, by which I mean taking away barriers and aligning policy so that we don't have policy that battles with other policy, and so that we can layer, bring together funding. And that would pick up on Candice's point that we tend to look at things in silos. So we look at mitigation separately from adaptation, perhaps separately from nature. And although local authorities don't want to do that, we're sort of pushed into that position. And I think Cornwall's decision-making wheel is really useful for looking at decisions in the whole. So that facilitating approach is needed. But some of the things that Philippa touched on, the fact we've had this top-down policy can work. It's worked on the landfill tax and it's worked to decarbonise our electricity system to a large degree. But now we are getting to these tricky things where over half the emissions cuts we've got to make are to do with individual and business decisions. So, and only 16% are things like you can just decide on your own without needing any help from anybody. So around housing, heat and energy in our buildings and housing sector and our transport sector, to make the right choices that are low emission choices, we need a lot of infrastructure, information and finance in place, we need information, so it needs to be easy to make those right choices, and that's where local authorities are a critical partner. So some of the things that I recommended in the report were having a really good delivery plan in place and monitoring it, but also building up training and capacity building and embedding everything around net zero and well adapted into decisions, building up a pipeline, the shovel ready idea, so that if funding does come forward, you've got something on the shelf to go, right, let's do this, it's on our wish list. Dorset's climate change plan is very good on that. And then collaborating across with other people, absolutely critical. And building up that green finance know-how. Candice, I thought your report was really interesting, that our finance is very centralised. So we see smatterings of local fundraising through community bonds that we've got in West Berkshire and Warrington. But we have very centralised investment pots where people are saying, we've got all this money, but we can't find the projects to fund. They're all too small, or they're too risky. But that's how they are. And in this pipeline, we need to put money in to develop the projects. And we might not be able to cluster them up into really big, easy to invest in pots. And the finance industry is going to have to deal with that. So we need to come up with ways to channel that money through. I thought, local building societies that you mentioned, we don't have as much, really interesting one. So I don't know how long I've been talking for. Andy, shall I carry on?
Yes, have another 2 minutes.
Thank you. So the key things, thinking about what local authorities should be doing, is starting to have a really good look at well done local area energy planning. So we can't just look at buildings on their own and energy efficiency. We've got to think about, what does the whole energy system at the local level look like? And how does that energy governance work? And that's a bit of a gap we've got. CSE and Energy System Catapult have developed a methodology for local area energy planning, which anyone can use, but it's got a big social and governance process as well as the technical bit in it. And I think building up those supply chains, knowing the housing sector, knowing what you've got up your sleeve that you need to tackle is really important. Planning, I keep saying about planning, I just don't want to go there, but building up really good evidence in the local plan, maybe temporary supplementary planning policy that can give local authorities that financial argument to make on viability for really good standard house building, which will sell for more, hopefully. And then transport, really not just thinking about the EV transition, but really thinking about putting that modal shift in place and how we do that. And I would just say, unlike me, perhaps, to not really heavily criticise the government, which I did pretty roundly in that report actually, is the fact that ministries' policies fight with each other, that people forget to think about local delivery. Hopefully we've learned a lot during this COVID crisis about the strength local authorities have got to know their communities and be trusted. But there are some promising signs, I think, that the ministries are speaking to each other. The fuel poverty strategy does that. And there are people in those departments who are working together, and hopefully in the new framework piece of work that I'm just starting to work on now, we'll be engaging with those ministries and saying, why does policy get made like that? What can we do to make it better? So I'll be back in touch with everybody to get you to help me out with the framework report, which we've got to get done by July. So yeah, thanks, Andy. I hope that was just 2 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Louise. That was great timing. Thank you still for keeping your comments coming and your voting in the Q&A section, which is great. We'll come to all of that in a second. But next up, can we hear from Councillor Edwina Hannaford from Cornwall Council about how all of this relates to your experiences on the ground, as it were. So Edwina, thank you.
Thank you. I think somebody's going to help me with some slides. Thank you very much. Greetings from sunny Cornwall, and thank you very much for inviting us. I'm going to give a little perspective from Cornwall, but having read the report, there's much there that I recognise. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to respond to this excellent new report, I've been asked to give a Cornish perspective and share some of the successes and challenges we have experienced. As one of the least developed areas in Europe and a series of issues such as fuel and transport poverty, Cornwall Council is very aware of how vulnerable Cornwall is to the impacts of climate change through our coastline and our agricultural land use. So we declared a climate emergency in January 2019, and only 6 months later, unanimously approved an ambitious climate change action plan with over 120 key actions to strive towards the Council and Cornwall being carbon neutral. Many of you will know that this is ambitious, and it may well prove impossible, but it will require us to act individually, but also as sector leaders if Cornwall is to achieve this crucial goal. And we're quite clear that our actions should not only tackle climate change and the climate emergency, but the ecological emergency, while ensuring the transition is just. Next slide, please. This is a very simplified depiction of the scale of the challenge that faces us. It is a hugely complex system with immeasurable moving parts, and there is no clear roadmap to where we are aiming. Making a declaration is the easy part. Working out how to start that journey, that's the hard bit. But building that complexity into your governance is even harder still. But this is the challenge we faced after our declaration, with political and public right behind us to make sure that this priority was embedded across Cornwall Council in all that we do. How to hold all that complexity with perspective across all of the present and potential impacts of climate emergency and avoid making the same decisions that got us here in the first place. Similarly, as the report mentions, this must be a just transition. In Cornwall, we cannot afford for climate change to be an accelerator of inequality. We could reach carbon neutrality relatively quickly if we ignored this and implemented sweeping policies overnight. But ultimately, carbon neutrality is only the mechanism by which we can achieve our real goal, which is a just, thriving and sustainable Cornwall for one of all. Next slide. Thankfully, Donut Economics presented us with a way to do this. Thanks to suggestions from inside and outside of the council, we were able to look at the work of Kate Rayworth, which she had undertaken with Oxfam, and consider how it could be applied in a Cornish context. The opportunities this presented was a way to engage with the idea that none of these boundaries occur in isolation, so that even if an action had benefits in one area, there may well be a myriad of negative consequences in others that we were just not equipped to notice. Next slide. So how does this work in practice? When our officer is bringing a decision to Cabinet, they must consider the impact the decision on each of the parts of the social and the planetary boundaries as shown here. They are broadly similar to the Kate Rayworth Oxfam sections, but they've been slightly adapted for a Cornish and a council focus. Then for each area, the guidance gives a number of questions to be answered. It's highly likely that an officer may not know the answer to every question, so it does prompt further exploration. We welcome feedback, which is clear where there are evidence gaps, as we can't expect us to know everything. But in highlighting what we don't know, it allows us to look more closely at issues which may otherwise have remained invisible. So garbage in, garbage out. Next slide. Thank you. So each area is then scored and giving a colour rating. And here is the end result, an example of a decision-making wheel in action for the Saints Trail multi-use active travel trail. This is a good example because it demonstrates that with a complex problem like the climate emergency, there are no perfect decisions. There will always be negative consequences. And if we can see a wheel that is too green, then we should immediately be suspicious. The key is not to downplay the negatives, but to understand and mitigate them or adapt the balance then against the positives. Here there might be short-term biodiversity loss or the potential for criminal activity, but the positive implications for carbon emissions, air pollution, health, connectivity, and more mean that a decision can be made in confidence. Next slide, please. So here's another example and a graphic representation, but this time showing the difference between the two decisions to intervene in a development project or not. This example suggests that there is no area that will be more negatively impacted through the intervention, though some areas will still experience a short-term or limited negative impact, as there are never any perfect solutions in a complex system. Next slide, please. So what's missing? It's not exhaustive. It's a measurement tool. It won't tell you whether to go ahead. It's still up to the decision maker to weigh all this up in the round. So it aids those decisions. At the moment, there's no difference between the sections, but some might be more important than others. And we are evolving this. It's not a static thing. It's being developed constantly. It's highly subjective to begin with as officers start to get used to it. And it's only a tool and only as good as those who use it. And that's why as a council, we've rolled out carbon literacy across all our 6,000 staff, and we're rolling that out to members as well. Next slide, please. So what has worked? It does make climate emergency accessible to decision makers. And as the cabinet member for climate change, I looked at that page first. And I look at the comprehensive impact assessment, and I challenge, and that makes up my colleagues who perhaps are not quite so honed in, think about that as well. It helps to hold that complexity in a nuanced way, and it shows that negative impacts or evidence gaps aren't ignored and they can be sought. And it's improved the transparency in our decision making. There's a bit of an appeal of being the first local authority to use this, but we are very keen to help others, so we do share. And it has started a real behaviour change in governance, a first step, but a crucial one. Next slide, please. So what next? Another benefit of taking this approach is the huge practical opportunities it creates for collaboration. The approach in Cornwall is very much about collaboration and partnership. So we have co-founded the Cornwall Donut Collective, made up of local authority, health, community, business, cultural organisations, and more, to co-design the next step in the donut economics across Cornwall. We held a public event in December. We had over 100 people attending, where we used the model to explore how different groups and organisations could adapt this model and share resources and data between them. The really exciting thing is it doesn't try to create a single vision of Cornwall's future that won't appeal to many. Instead, it encourages us to simply to ask the same questions. We will likely all answer them in our own way, but if we are asking the same questions, then it gives decision makers a mandate to do things differently and embrace that complexity in a way we are not used to. Which we must do if we are going to achieve the scale of the change that's needed. Marix, thank you, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. So we have 20 minutes or so for questions, and we have a healthy list of them emerging in the Q&A. Keep them coming. But the first question for the panel, I think, is from Ed Goman from Nezero, Liverpool, I think. Ed, you're very welcome. Glad to see you with us. And Ed asks, it's targeted to Kevin, but hopefully it's okay for the panel too. What's the best form of climate commission? Should they be council-led? If not, and they're independent, how should we think about funding and supporting them, and what kind of powers should they have? So it's a question very close to my own heart. We're going to leave it to the panel to discuss. Anybody?
I can chime in there, Andy, but I very much invite you to contribute to this as well, particularly seeing as the Yorkshire and Humber Commission was launched last night. I guess I would answer that question with another question, which is best for whom? So in designing these commissions, the way in which we can assess their success is the extent to which they're co-produced with the members, and the extent to which they bring in different actors that are representative of the local expertise and the local actors that are affected by and want to be involved in climate change action. So we're seeing this through the PCAN core commissions in Belfast, Leeds and Edinburgh, but also in the growing network of commissions that include for example, Surrey, like I said, Yorkshire and Humber. And we're seeing that different commissions focus on different aspects. So some might focus a little bit more on finance, others on mitigation and looking across sectors. So in terms of financing these commissions, I think, Andy, you might be able to provide a bit more from your own experience, but the sources of funding can come from a range of different areas. So I would sort of, in answering to that question, I would go back to my own question, which is how do we assess what is best in terms of a commission?
Do any of the other panelists want to say? Louise?
Yeah, I thought this is interesting because you, in the report, you haven't yet been able to understand how much the commissions push delivery forwards yet, because they're still quite new. My experience of one is, it's not, I don't know if it's a commission, it's not formally called that. It's the approach taken in Greater Manchester, which was very co-produced, the first Green Summit in 2018. So it brought a lot of different people and experts together, and it built on what was already in place by way of different sort of hubs that existed across the combined authority. So you had the utilities companies and key businesses. We did a lot of engagement, and we've got a group that we're reassessing what we're for as we move forward through their 5-year plan. And some of the things that have come up is the continued engagement, so we can raise expectation and bring a lot of people in. But then we've had we've had 2 more Green Summits since, including a virtual one, because we want to keep that engagement and that 2-way communication going. But then the power piece of what governance do we have if I'm sitting on a 5-year environment forum? I can't make anyone do anything. So I think it's about enabling and pushing things forward and challenging. And I think it's driving towards delivery using a mission-based approach, which is something UCL had developed, and they're continuing to work with UCL. But one of the other things that jumps into my mind is who's missing from it, and we're addressing that at the moment. And that brings me back round to who's interested in sitting on it and contributing, but who can afford to be on it. And I think there's a piece about justice there, because you mentioned you can have the big consultancies or big businesses, but there's a lot of people on it who've got to take a day off work to be on it. And finding a way to bring them in is important. So that's normally voluntary. So I don't have an answer, but I think pushing towards delivery is really important.
Just to add very quickly, PCAN is working with and supports a range of established and emergent commissions. And in the spirit of place-based approaches, there is no one-size-fits-all, I think. However, the Yorkshire Commission that we launched last night, it is independent. It's supported by the councils, but not part of the councils. And part of its job is to track progress, and that involves a level of independence and a level of transparency and so on. In terms of its funding, it has support from the councils, but also from other anchor institutions in the area. And I think that's the big challenge. How do we supplement the capacities of local government, because local government can't do it all, and commissions have a key role to play in providing a kind of complementary aspect. But funding for that is a challenge, and ideally, I suppose, it would be funded from within the region or within the area, but then clearly there are some trade-offs with independence on that aspect. So I don't think there's a very straightforward or one-size-fits-all answer to that question necessarily. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. Julie Ridley asks, what kind of actions would we see if there was more of a focus on adaptation? We'll focus on that part first. So what about the resilience and the adaptation story? That's sometimes being slightly crowded out by the net zero story. Is there more we can do to promote that through these kind of local initiatives? Anyone? Philippa?
Yeah, I don't have lots to say on it, but I guess people are still quite hopeful, so that's probably why it's not as heard as the net zero thing. And I think local authorities need to see they need to see the nature emergency as equal to the climate emergency. I mean, they go completely hand in hand, and I think action on adaptation absolutely needs to have a strong nature focus a lot. I think that the kind of local engagement thing also comes into this, having proper conversations with local businesses, farmers, for example, who will play a really key role in adaptation. And then finally, I won't go into the planning system, but I guess reform, making sure that the planning system works for future adaptation, and making sure that, you know, our buildings are prepared for what might change. And this came out in our interviews quite a lot, was that the reason why local authorities have declared climate emergencies is because they're starting to see the effects of what's actually happening in their local levels. So yeah, I think definitely kind of having that conversation is absolutely key.
Thank you. Edwina, I'll come to you in a second if that's okay, but Candice, you lead the adaptation platform for PCAN. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's quite a difficult one. So as I said, you know, mitigation is very much the focus of the climate emergency declarations and resulting climate action plans. And the work that we're going to be doing through the PCAN adaptation platform is to really try and essentially gather an understanding of what is the landscape of action on climate change adaptation. And we're hoping to do that by getting an assessment of what are the key vulnerabilities and risks that, for example, each of the PCAN commissions are facing now, and how that will evolve with time, and to get an understanding of the vulnerability. So I think there's a core piece of work that needs to be done there to understand what are the impacts that are being experienced now, and how are they likely to get worse or better in future. And as Philippa was saying, also to get an understanding of who are the key constituents, who are the key actors who are affected by climate change, or who will be involved in solutions for climate change, whether it's adaptation or mitigation. I think another couple of key points are, one is looking at how action on adaptation can be more embedded alongside mitigation action. So for example, when looking at energy efficiency and retrofits, to make sure that those actions that are aimed at reducing emissions don't then lead to issues of ventilation, which can cause more issues when it comes to heat risk episodes. And then a final point I'll just mention now is the skills that are required to address adaptation are very different to those required to deliver mitigation. So there's a real need to understand what are the differences there, what are the capacities and expertises within local authority teams, and how can they be addressed so that we get more of a balance with adaptation and mitigation.
Great, thank you. Edwina, what about in Cornwall? How has Cornwall integrated the adaptation and resilience story into its climate action plans?
Thank you. So the climate, the donut economics helps with that, but we've embedded it in everything that we do. So it's not just the climate change team that lead this, it's adult care, it's the planners, it's embedded in the culture of the organisation. Although the climate change team might have some of the expertise to help, it's a whole of organisation approach. So the pandemic has actually accelerated a lot of that change. We were already on a road to more home working, more local hubs, sort of part of the localism and sort of decentralisation approach. So I think still 4,000 of our staff are still working from home at the moment. So we're reorganising all our property to facilitate that home working and that local hubs. I heard you talk about changes to the planning system. Of course, we bump up to the National Planning Policy Framework, but in Cornwall, and we're waiting for government to make up its mind and make some announcements about future home standards, etc. But what we've done in Cornwall is that we are developing a development plan document, climate change development plan document, so it'd be part of the suite of local plan documents, and we can push as far as we can against that top-down national planning policy framework. We can also control and change by where we have influence. So as a unitary, we are the control waste in Cornwall. So we are introducing late to the party food waste collection from the doorstep. But we have control over that. We can control it a bit more by our investments. So we source all of our energy from renewable sources as an organisation, and 40% of Cornwall's energy does come from renewables for the electricity that we use. We put some direct investments into wind turbines in partnership with others. So I think we're trying to practice what we preach, but I think the main thing is partnership, co-production, collaboration. The council is not the parent of this. it has to be a whole of Cornwall, and that's it takes a lot of time and effort when we're pushed for resources, pushed for capacity, pushing against top-down national policies as well. So it's not easy, but I think it's a culture within the council from the top and the bottom up.
Perfect, thank you, Edwina. I'm going to merge the next two questions, which are from Matt Hannon, hi Matt, and Rich Young, both around climate finance. So Matt asks, how can local government, I'm going to paraphrase a bit here, but how can local government and councils facilitate the indirect financing of local climate action? What platforms or frameworks or initiatives can local authorities put in place that enable money to flow into climate action? And are there any examples in Rich's question where there's a project or a community-driven initiative that wanted money but couldn't find it? I'm sure there are lots here in Leeds and probably in most places, but yeah, is there anybody comfortable taking that question on?
I can start if you like.
Please do.
Okay, so what, good question. So what Cornwall Council have done is that we've formed a partnership with Crowdfunder, which is a Cornish company, and we provide match funding for whether it's a town and parish council to do an audit or to help get some expertise for its action planning. We've got a match fund for tree planting, so the bit of offsetting as well. But a project that comes to yesterday, we launched a Back the Future crowdfunder. So we're going to try and tap into our visitors to Cornwall to see if they can make voluntary donations to help the communities of Cornwall do some of the work, fantastic work that's going on in our communities. The only other project that comes to mind is for a wind turbine, 3.2 megawatt wind turbine on a council-owned farm. We entered in partnership with Centrica, and it's the first smart grid connected wind turbine. And it was the first wind turbine to be built in Cornwall since 2016, partly because of grid connection problems, but it just wasn't viable. But it was when we went into partnership, and that generates an income not just for the council but for the community in which it sits as well.
Thank you, Edwina. Louise.
I think it's interesting, isn't it, to look at that question Matthew's put, which is the block grants have been decimated. So it's the way we fund or finance local climate action, because it spans so much. So we've got funding for highways or roads, or bits of funding for cycling and walking infrastructure, and it comes down lots of it comes down, less than it should be. And then we look at little bits of funding like £1 million bond, which is a lot of money to raise and to deliver a solar farm, but which is a discrete piece of money, I suppose, for one particular project. And so there are different ways through borrowing, through municipal bonds, through joint ventures like Bristol City Leap, which is sort of trying to package up this big opportunity for the heat network. Then we've got investment pots like Heat Network Investment Project. And then more and more councils setting up their own housing development companies to both demonstrate and deliver, and to get around the planning thing, because you can build them to great standards. And then we've got money that might come through from Leapfrog finance, for example, to sort of bridge fund a big investment. But this is the piece I think that I've never really got to grips with, which is all this money comes down. It's spent in different pots at different speeds with different outcomes needed from government. And yet we sort of talk about spending it on climate action, whereas everything the council should be doing should deliver all those things in Edwina's magic donut circle. So I think seeing it as separate little pots isn't always helpful, but it is necessary. So that was a real, I can see myself in Zoom waffling. So I think a really, really good look. I'd wanted to look at what do the accounts or the budgets of a council look like when it's net zero. And that was a piece of work I didn't manage to pull off last year. Something for SIPFA there, I think, or a challenge from Cornwall and some of these treasurers who've got it, started thinking about it. I'll shut up now, Andy, if you kick me under the table otherwise.
Never, Louise. I think there's a really interesting point there around how local government can catalyse other people to invest in low carbon, and whether there's a temptation to try and directly fund climate activities, and whether councils are brave enough instead to set up a platform that enables other people to fund them is a big question. And we're working with Surrey County Council on that kind of topic at the moment. Candice, you flagged.
Yeah, just very quickly to add to what Louise was saying, in terms of the funding available at the local level, in conversations we had in pulling together the report, some of the key barriers that I alluded to in my presentation around finance, there were some very simple barriers that felt that could be addressed rather swiftly, and some were around the red tape involved, or the timescales within which councils were required to apply for funding and then deliver the funding, or the way in which different pots of funding, almost the application process, conflicted with each other. So there's some real tangible issues there as well that were felt needed to be addressed to unlock some of that funding, which was available, but at times was seen as too much of a headache to even apply for.
Thank you. I think we have time for one really quick question. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give a 20-second response, if that's okay. And the question is from Julian Dean, and it's about whether there's a plan for a major lobbying effort to national government to try and develop a framework or change the context of the relationship between national and local government. I presume that relates especially to England, where we have a different structure maybe from Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. Louise, I know that was a central part of your report. Can I ask you first to set out your thoughts really quickly, if that's okay?
Yeah, that was a big recommendation in the report. And then unfortunately, UK 100 have got some money from somewhere and said, okay, go on then, design it. So that's the next project. I mean, I'm not saying everyone's crowding around this one. So someone did say, is there a danger somebody might listen to it? Hopefully there is. So that's what I'm working on, and I'm hoping to catch up with PCAN people on that in April. But we will be building a straw one, then a stick one, and I want to test it with lots of local authorities and stakeholders. So I'll shamelessly plug it because I'll be running a couple of events. So yes, please, Julian.
We will look forward to hearing back from you on that then, Louise. Edwina, and then I'll come to Philippa and then Candice. Edwina, what do you think about advocating for a new framework that would help you to do the job that you need to do in Cornwall with more support from national government?
I think it's absolutely needed. Our climate declarations actually said call on government to provide the resources and the powers for us to deliver. And I think government, we very much, they talk about localism and decentralising, but I don't think they're acting like it. It is command and control. And I don't think they really have allowed local authorities to unleash our expertise and our connection to our communities. I think we are undervalued. So one of the ways that Cornwall are doing that is through the UK 100, and we're also part of the Climate Change Resilience Task Force as well, along with Andy Burnham and other of the big metropolitan authorities, and more rurally through the Rural Climate Change Alliance. So it's definitely needed, but if you're asking, somebody has to be listening, and I'm not sure that it's so disparate and there are other priorities at the moment. I'm not sure government as a whole are listening with any cohesion.
Good point. Thank you, Edwina. Philippa, quickly.
Yeah, I'm also going to do a shameless plug of the Blueprint Coalition, which ADEPT leads up with a number of other academics and charities, and we're part of that. And councils can sign up to that, and it has very similar recommendations to what we've all said today. And we've been doing some workshops as part of this group. Well, we've done one, but we've got more coming up with government departments, including MHCLG, BEIS, Treasury, DFT, properly having those conversations about what needs to happen for local authorities, including the point which is in the question. So sign up to that.
Great, thank you, Philippa. Candice, can you wrap up for us?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really great question to sort of end this discussion on. I was really pleased and really positive to see that actually all of the reports that are represented today call for this framework, and it's really encouraging to see that the work is ongoing. One of the great things about PCAN is that we are iterative, we're reflective, and a lot of what we do is very much in response to what is identified as a need. So we would really welcome the opportunity to carry on these conversations and with all those who are interested in doing this about how do we actually come up with a framework that is tangible, that can be implemented, and that can really have a meaningful impact. So thanks very much.
Great. So just to wrap up, sorry we've overrun by 2 or 3 minutes, but thank you so much for all your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them. Stay tuned into PCAN as we move forward, and to Louise's work as well, and I'm sure Green Alliance as well, address a lot of the questions that we haven't been able to talk about today. But just remains for me to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for your fantastic contributions and your great work more broadly, and thank you all for tuning in, and we will look forward to speaking to you, and who knows, maybe even meeting you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.